The morning fog clung to the streets of Charleston, West Virginia, as Dr. Rebecca Chen carried the wooden crate up the steps of the Mountain State Historical Archive. It was early October 2024, and the autumn air had that sharp quality that made everything feel crisp and immediate. Inside the crate, wrapped in acid-free tissue and protective foam, was a daguerreotype that had been donated to the archive by the estate of Agnes Thornton, a woman who had passed away at 97, leaving behind a house full of historical treasures collected over a lifetime of antiquing and estate sale hunting. Rebecca was the archive's chief photographic historian, a position she had held for 8 years after completing her doctorate in American visual culture at the University of Virginia. At 42, she had examined thousands of 19th-century photographs, each one a frozen moment of lives long past, faces staring out from another era with expressions that ranged from stern formality to barely suppressed joy. The technology of early photography had required subjects to hold perfectly still for exposures that could last 30 seconds or more, resulting in the solemn, unsmiling faces that characterized most images from that period. But this particular photograph was different, and Rebecca had known it from the moment she first saw it during the estate inventory. The image showed 9 people arranged on the porch of a substantial log home, the kind of solid construction that spoke of prosperity and permanence in 1882 Appalachia. The setting was clearly rural, with dense forest visible in the soft focus background and split-rail fencing marking the property boundaries. What made the photograph unusual was the composition and the expressions. In the center stood a woman who appeared to be in her late 30s, tall and commanding, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that stared directly at the camera with remarkable intensity. Around her were 8 children, ranging in age from perhaps 4 to 15. Unlike most period photographs where children looked uncomfortable or frightened by the strange camera apparatus, these children had relaxed, natural expressions. Several were almost smiling, a rarity for the era. The oldest child, a girl of about 15, had her hand resting on the shoulder of the youngest, a small boy who clutched what appeared to be a carved wooden horse. The arrangement spoke of genuine affection and connection, not the stiff formality typical of Victorian portrait photography. What had immediately caught Rebecca's attention, however, was something more subtle. The children, while clearly cared for and dressed in clean, well-mended clothing, showed remarkable physical diversity. Their facial features, coloring, and build varied so dramatically that they couldn't possibly all be biological siblings. Yet the photograph was labeled in faded ink on the back. The Morrison family, Grayson County, Virginia, 1882. Rebecca carried the crate into her laboratory, a climate-controlled room filled with specialized equipment for analyzing and preserving historical photographs. Her assistant, James Kowalski, was already there, preparing the digital scanning station. James was 28, a recent graduate of the archive's professional training program, with an obsessive attention to detail that made him perfect for preservation work. He had the kind of patience that allowed him to spend hours examining a single photograph, noting every tiny detail that might provide historical context. "Is that the Morrison portrait?" James asked, helping Rebecca carefully remove the photograph from its protective wrapping. "The one you've been excited about all week?" "This is it," Rebecca confirmed, placing the daguerreotype on the examination table under soft, specialized lighting that wouldn't damage the delicate image. "Look at the composition, James. Tell me what you see." James leaned in, his trained eye moving systematically across the image. 9 subjects, 1 adult female, 8 children. Substantial dwelling, indicating economic stability. Clothing is modest but well-maintained, suggesting careful household management. The children's positioning shows comfort with each other and with the central figure. But the physical characteristics are inconsistent with a single biological family unit. Different hair colors, facial structures, even what appears to be different ethnic backgrounds, though it's hard to be certain with the image quality of the period. "Exactly," Rebecca said, feeling that familiar thrill of discovery that came when a historical artifact refused to fit expected patterns. "This isn't a typical family portrait. Something else is going on here, and I want to know what it is." Over the next 3 days, Rebecca subjected the photograph to every analytical technique available to modern archival science. She created high-resolution digital scans that revealed details invisible to the naked eye. She analyzed the clothing styles, cross-referencing them with period fashion plates to confirm the dating. She examined the photographic technique itself, determining that the image had been made by a skilled photographer using a field camera, probably one of the traveling portrait artists who moved through rural areas offering their services to families who could afford them. But it was the background details that provided the first real clue. Using image enhancement software, Rebecca was able to clarify objects that appeared in the soft focus behind the main subjects. There was a wooden sign, partially visible, that seemed to read Morrison Home 4. But the rest was obscured. She could also make out what appeared to be a small schoolhouse or chapel building separate from the main dwelling, and what might have been a vegetable garden laid out in organized rows. "James, look at this," Rebecca called out on the third day of analysis. She had been comparing the Morrison photograph to other images in the archive's collection, searching for anything that might provide context. "I found 3 other photographs from Grayson County taken in the 1880s. None of them show the Morrison family, but look at the backgrounds, the architectural styles, the landscape features. I think I can pinpoint approximately where this photograph was taken." James examined the comparison images on her dual monitors. "That's the new river valley, isn't it? The mountain profiles in the background, the type of forest composition. It's distinctive." "I think so too," Rebecca agreed. "And if I'm right, that means we can narrow down the location significantly. Grayson County wasn't heavily populated in 1882, and a property with buildings this substantial would have been notable. There should be land records, tax documents, maybe even mentions in local newspapers if we know where to look." The breakthrough came not from the photograph itself but from a completely unexpected source. Rebecca had posted a query on a professional historians forum, describing the image and asking if anyone had encountered references to Morrison Home in southwestern Virginia during the 1880s. 3 days later, she received a response from Dr. Harold Emerson, a retired professor of Appalachian studies who had spent 40 years researching the social history of the region. "Dear Dr. Chen," his email began, "I believe you may have stumbled upon something quite significant. The Morrison home was indeed real, though it has been largely forgotten by history. It was operated by Elizabeth Morrison, a remarkable woman who ran what we would today call an orphanage, though the term wasn't commonly used at that time. I have some documentation about her work, and I would be very interested in seeing the photograph you described. If it is indeed what I think it is, it represents one of the only known images of Elizabeth Morrison and the children in her care." Rebecca felt her heart rate accelerate as she read the email. An orphanage. That would explain the physical diversity of the children, the substantial property with multiple buildings, the careful organization visible even in a single photograph. She immediately wrote back to Dr. Emerson, attaching high-resolution scans of the image and asking if he could provide any additional information about Elizabeth Morrison and her work. His response came within hours, and it included an attachment, a scanned document from the Grayson County Historical Society archives. It was a handwritten report dated 1885, prepared by a state inspector who had been sent to evaluate charitable institutions in the region. The report described the Morrison Home for Displaced Children in glowing terms, praising Elizabeth Morrison's organization, her educational programs, and the obvious care and affection she showed toward the children under her protection. "Mrs. Morrison operates her home without state funding or church sponsorship," the inspector had written. "She supports the children through her own labor, farming 40 acres of productive land and selling produce, preserved goods, and textile work at regional markets. The children are educated, receiving instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, and practical skills that will serve them well in adulthood. They are healthy, well-fed, and remarkably well-adjusted given the tragedies most have experienced. Mrs. Morrison has created something exceptional here, a model of what private charity can accomplish when driven by genuine compassion and skillful management." Rebecca read the report 3 times, her mind racing with questions. Who was Elizabeth Morrison? Where had she come from? How had she ended up operating an orphanage in rural Virginia in the 1880s? What had happened to the children? What had happened to Elizabeth herself? The photograph, which had started as simply an interesting historical artifact, had become the key to a story that clearly deserved to be told. She called Dr. Emerson, and they spoke for over an hour. He explained that he had encountered references to Elizabeth Morrison while researching early childcare institutions in Appalachia, but had been unable to learn much about her personal history. The Morrison home had operated from approximately 1878 until 1895, at which point the trail went cold. Dr. Emerson had always wondered what happened, whether the home had closed because of Elizabeth's death or for some other reason, but he had never been able to find definitive answers. The children in that photograph, Dr. Emerson said, his voice thoughtful, they would have come from all over the region. Orphaned by disease, by mining accidents, by the general hardships of frontier life. Elizabeth took them in regardless of background or circumstance. According to the few records I've found, she never turned away a child who genuinely needed help. In an era when orphanages were often grim institutions where children were treated as burdens, she created something different. A real home. After the call ended, Rebecca sat at her desk for a long time, staring at the photograph on her screen. The faces of those 9 people, Elizabeth and her 8 children, looked back at her across nearly a century and a half. They had no idea that their image would survive, that someday a historian would study their faces and try to reconstruct their lives. But they had gathered for that photograph, had arranged themselves carefully, had held still through the long exposure. They had wanted to be remembered. "We need to find out what happened to them," Rebecca said aloud, though James had left for the day and she was alone in the lab. They deserved to have their story told. The next morning, Rebecca began what would become a months-long research project. She started with land records, tracing the ownership of the property where the Morrison home had stood. The records showed that Elizabeth Morrison had purchased 40 acres in Grayson County in 1877, paying cash for the land, an unusual transaction for a single woman in that era. She had built the main house and outbuildings over the next year, a remarkable feat of construction that suggested she had either hired help or possessed unusual skills herself. Tax records showed that Elizabeth had consistently paid her obligations, that she had steadily improved the property, adding a barn, a spring house, a chicken coop, and that separate building that might have been a schoolhouse. The property had been productive, the assessed value increasing year after year as she developed the land into a successful small farm. But it was the census records that provided the most fascinating information. The 1880 census, taken 2 years before the photograph, listed Elizabeth Morrison, age 37, head of household, occupation, farmer and teacher. Living with her were 7 children, none of them sharing her surname. The census taker had noted their ages and birthplaces, and Rebecca realized with growing excitement that this documented evidence confirmed what the photograph suggested. These weren't Elizabeth's biological children. They were orphans she had taken in, children from different families, different backgrounds, brought together under one roof and formed into something new. Rebecca created a spreadsheet, cross-referencing the names from the 1880 census with other historical records. She found birth certificates, death certificates of parents, records of mining accidents and disease outbreaks that had left children without families. Each child had a story of loss, of tragedy that had brought them to Elizabeth Morrison's door. And each child had found, at least for a time, safety and care. One name in particular caught her attention: Sarah Lynn, age 8 in 1880, birthplace listed as California. This was highly unusual for rural Virginia in that era. Rebecca dug deeper, eventually finding records showing that Sarah's parents had been Chinese immigrants who had come east after working on the Transcontinental Railroad. They had died in a typhoid outbreak in 1879, and somehow their daughter had ended up traveling across the country to arrive at the Morrison home. How did that happen? Rebecca wondered aloud. How did a Chinese orphan from California end up in the care of a woman running an informal orphanage in Appalachian, Virginia? James, who had been helping with the research, had a theory. Maybe there was a network, he suggested. Churches, charitable organizations, people who knew about the Morrison home and sent children there when they had nowhere else to go. Elizabeth Morrison might have been known beyond just her immediate region. It was a compelling theory, and as Rebecca continued her research, she found evidence supporting it. Letters in various archival collections mentioned the Morrison woman in Virginia who takes children, describing her as unconventional but kind and running a proper home despite unusual circumstances. One letter, written by a Presbyterian minister in Tennessee, recommended that a colleague in his network contact Elizabeth Morrison about placing 3 orphan siblings, noting that she will keep them together, which few institutions will do. The photograph took on new layers of meaning as Rebecca learned more about each person visible in the frame. She identified 6 of the 8 children with reasonable certainty, matching their apparent ages in the 1882 photograph to census and other records. Each identification was like solving a small puzzle, connecting a face frozen in time to a name and a backstory. Thomas Brennan, the oldest boy visible in the photograph, had been 11 when his father was killed in a coal mining accident in 1879. His mother had died giving birth to his younger sister 2 years earlier, and that sister, Mary, was also in the photograph, a quiet-looking girl of about 9. The Brennan siblings had arrived at the Morrison home together, and according to one brief mention in a county record, Elizabeth had made a special trip to the mining camp to collect them, refusing to allow them to be separated and sent to different relatives who didn't want both children. Rebecca found herself becoming emotionally invested in these people, in their stories of loss and survival. Late at night, working alone in the archive, she would look at their faces and imagine their lives. What had it been like for 8-year-old Sarah Lynn, who had lost her parents and traveled thousands of miles to arrive at a log home in the Virginia mountains, where the language and customs and landscape were all completely foreign? How had Elizabeth Morrison made her feel safe and welcome? What kind of extraordinary person could create a home that transcended such enormous differences in background and experience? 3 months into her research, Rebecca received an email that would dramatically expand her understanding of Elizabeth Morrison's life and work. It came from a woman named Catherine Grant, a genealogist based in Richmond who had seen Rebecca's inquiries on several historical forums. Catherine specialized in tracing family histories for African American families whose genealogical records had been disrupted by slavery and its aftermath, and she believed she had information relevant to Rebecca's research. "I've been researching the Morrison home for personal reasons," Catherine's email explained. "My great-great-grandfather, Daniel Grant, lived there as a child in the early 1880s. He was born into slavery in 1869, freed as an infant, but orphaned at age 7 when his mother died of pneumonia. His father had died before his birth. According to family oral history, he was taken in by a white woman in Virginia who ran a home for children, and he always spoke of her with tremendous gratitude and respect. When I saw your research about Elizabeth Morrison, I realized this must be the same place. I have some family documents that might be helpful, including letters Daniel wrote later in life describing his time at the Morrison home." Rebecca arranged a video call with Catherine immediately. The genealogist was in her 50s, with warm brown eyes and the methodical demeanor of someone who had spent years piecing together fragmented histories. She shared her screen to show scanned copies of letters that her great-great-grandfather had written in the 1920s and 1930s, reminiscences of his childhood at the Morrison home. The letters were remarkable, providing first-hand accounts of daily life in Elizabeth Morrison's unconventional household. Daniel described learning to read and write from Elizabeth, working alongside the other children in the gardens and fields, attending the informal school sessions Elizabeth held every morning. He wrote about the sense of belonging he had felt, the way Elizabeth had treated all the children equally regardless of their backgrounds, enforcing rules fairly and showing affection openly. "She never made me feel lesser because of my race," Daniel had written in a letter to his own daughter in 1928. "In that time and place, that was extraordinary. I knew even as a child that the Morrison home was different from the world outside its boundaries. Elizabeth created a space where we were judged by our character and behavior, not by circumstances of birth we couldn't control. She prepared us to face a world that wouldn't be as fair, but she also showed us what was possible, what America could be if we lived up to its ideals." Catherine wiped her eyes as Rebecca finished reading the letter aloud. "He talked about her until the day he died," Catherine said. "He became a teacher himself, spent his whole career educating black children in Virginia during segregation. He used to say that Elizabeth Morrison had given him the gift of believing in his own worth and potential, and that he tried to pass that gift on to every child he taught. Through Catherine's research, Rebecca learned that Daniel had been one of at least 3 black children who had lived at the Morrison home during its operation. In 1880s Virginia, this was remarkable. Racial attitudes were hardening as Reconstruction ended and Jim Crow laws began to take hold across the South. Integrated institutions were rare and controversial. Yet Elizabeth Morrison had apparently taken in children regardless of race, creating a multiracial household at a time when such arrangements were socially unacceptable to many. She must have faced enormous pressure, Rebecca said during one of her conversations with Catherine. Community judgment, possibly threats. How did she manage it? How did she protect the children and keep the home operating? I think geography helped, Catherine suggested. The Morrison home was relatively isolated, on its own 40 acres. And I suspect Elizabeth was strategic about how she presented herself and her work. She didn't advertise what she was doing. She didn't draw attention. She just quietly took in children who needed help and raised them as well as she could. Rebecca dove back into the archives with renewed focus, looking for any evidence of community reaction to the Morrison home. She found a few references in church records, mentions of the Morrison situation, and concerns about proper Christian guidance, but nothing overtly hostile. It seemed that Elizabeth had been viewed with some suspicion by conservative elements of the community, but her competence and the obvious care she provided to the children had earned grudging respect. What Rebecca couldn't find, despite exhaustive searching, was information about Elizabeth Morrison's background before she appeared in Grayson County in 1877. There was no record of her birth, no indication of where she had come from or why she had chosen to dedicate her life to caring for orphan children. It was as if she had materialized fully formed in the Virginia mountains with resources, skills, and determination, ready to build something extraordinary. The mystery of Elizabeth's origins became the next focus of Rebecca's investigation. She expanded her search to surrounding states, looking for any woman named Elizabeth Morrison who might match the right age and time frame. She contacted archives across the region, combed through digitized newspaper collections, searched military pension records and passenger ship manifests. For weeks, she found nothing. Then, following a hunch, Rebecca began searching records related to the Civil War. Virginia had been devastated by the conflict, with battles fought across the state and communities torn apart by divided loyalties. Many women had lost husbands, fathers, brothers, sons. Many had been forced to become self-sufficient, to manage farms and businesses, to survive in circumstances that would have been unimaginable before the war. In the National Archives, buried in a collection of Union Army records, Rebecca found a reference that made her heart race. A letter dated 1863, written by a Union officer stationed in Northern Virginia, mentioned a civilian woman named Elizabeth Morrison who had assisted the Army as a nurse. The officer praised her medical skills and her courage under fire, noting that she had treated wounded soldiers from both sides despite the risks involved. "She is remarkable in every respect," the officer had written. "Educated beyond what is common for her sex, skilled in surgery and medicine, and utterly fearless in the face of danger. She has lost her husband and infant son to the fever, and has devoted herself to saving others' lives. The Army owes her a debt we can never repay." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. Could this be the same Elizabeth Morrison? The timeline worked, the location was right, and the description of unusual education and medical skills matched the evidence of competence and capability visible in everything Elizabeth had later accomplished. A woman who had nursed soldiers during the Civil War would have developed organizational abilities, would have learned to manage resources under impossible conditions, would have seen death and suffering on a scale that would make her determined to preserve and protect life wherever possible. She searched for more references to Elizabeth Morrison as a Civil War nurse and found 2 additional mentions in soldiers' letters and military records. Both confirmed her medical work and her personal losses. Her husband, Thomas Morrison, had been a Union soldier who died of disease in 1862. Their infant son had died in the same epidemic. After that, Elizabeth had apparently attached herself to various Union medical units, following the armies and treating wounded soldiers wherever she could be useful. That's where she learned, Rebecca said to James as they reviewed the findings. In the worst circumstances imaginable, dealing with trauma and death and chaos, she learned how to organize, how to manage scarce resources, how to make life or death decisions under pressure. And when the war ended, she took those skills and used them to create something positive, a place where children who had lost everything could find safety and hope. The pieces of Elizabeth Morrison's life were coming together, but Rebecca still had major questions. What had happened between the war's end in 1865 and Elizabeth's appearance in Grayson County in 1877? Where had she gotten the money to purchase land and build the Morrison home? What had driven her to dedicate her life to caring for orphan children? Some answers came from an unexpected source. Rebecca had contacted every historical society in southwestern Virginia, asking if they had any records or artifacts related to Elizabeth Morrison. Most had nothing, but the Carroll County Historical Society responded with information that proved crucial. They had a small collection of documents donated in the 1950s by a woman who claimed to be the niece of someone who had lived at the Morrison home as a child. The collection included letters, photographs, and a handwritten memoir. Rebecca drove to Hillsville, Virginia, on a cold November morning to examine the collection in person. The Historical Society occupied a converted schoolhouse, its rooms filled with the accumulated material culture of the region's past. The volunteer archivist, an elderly man named Walter Brooks, had already pulled the Morrison collection for her and set it up in a research room with good lighting. "We've had this for decades," Walter explained as Rebecca carefully opened the archive boxes. "Nobody's looked at it in years. People today mostly want information about Civil War battles or famous families. They're not usually interested in stories about orphans and the people who cared for them." But Rebecca was intensely interested, and what she found in those boxes exceeded her hopes. The memoir, written in careful longhand by someone named Rachel Morrison Bennett, told the story of her time at the Morrison home from 1883 to 1890, when she had been between the ages of 7 and 14. Rachel had arrived at the home after her parents died in a house fire. She had been burned herself, left with scars that had made her self-conscious and withdrawn. Elizabeth had welcomed her anyway, had treated her burns with salves and careful dressing changes, had helped her heal both physically and emotionally. "Miss Elizabeth never treated me like I was damaged," Rachel had written. "She said my scars were proof that I had survived, that I was strong. She taught me to read and write, to cook and sew, to manage a household. But more than that, she taught me that my worth wasn't determined by my appearance or my past tragedies. She taught me that I could build a good life despite everything I had lost." The memoir described daily routines at the Morrison home with vivid detail. The children rose early to do chores, feeding animals and working in the gardens before breakfast. Elizabeth led morning lessons in the main room of the house, teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography. Afternoons were devoted to practical skills, with older children helping teach younger ones. Evenings were for games, storytelling, and what Rachel called family time, when Elizabeth would gather all the children and talk with them about their days, their worries, their hopes for the future. What struck Rebecca most forcefully was Rachel's description of how Elizabeth handled the diversity of her household. She didn't ignore differences in background or pretend they didn't exist. Instead, she acknowledged them openly and taught the children to appreciate diversity as strength. When Sarah Lynn struggled with homesickness for her Chinese parents and the culture she had lost, Elizabeth encouraged her to share memories and customs with the other children. When Daniel faced racist treatment during a rare trip to town, Elizabeth used the experience to teach all the children about injustice and the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. She was building something more than just a home, Rebecca said to James during a video call after she returned from Hillsville. She was deliberately creating a community that challenged the prejudices and divisions of her society. She was raising children to see beyond race and background, to judge people as individuals. In the 1880s, that was radical. That was revolutionary. James nodded thoughtfully. And the photograph captures that moment, preserves it. All 9 of them together, looking comfortable with each other, looking like a real family despite being bound by choice and circumstance rather than blood. No wonder it looks different from typical period portraits. It was documenting something genuinely unusual. Rebecca spent the next 2 months tracking down every child visible in the 1882 photograph, trying to learn what had happened to them after they left the Morrison home. It was painstaking work, following fragmentary trails through census records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and occasional mentions in local histories. But gradually, she pieced together their adult lives, and what she found was remarkable. Thomas Brennan, the oldest boy, had become a teacher in West Virginia. Mary Brennan had married a farmer and raised 6 children of her own. Sarah Lynn had moved to San Francisco as a young adult, reconnecting with the Chinese community there and working as a translator and advocate for immigrant rights. Daniel Grant, as Catherine had already told her, had devoted his life to education. Of the 8 children visible in the photograph, Rebecca was able to trace 6 of them into adulthood, and all 6 had become productive, successful people who contributed to their communities in meaningful ways. The outcomes are statistically significant, Rebecca told Dr. Emerson during one of their regular phone calls. Children who grew up in the Morrison home had better life outcomes than orphans placed in institutional settings or those who were informally passed between relatives. They were more likely to complete education, to maintain stable employment, to marry and have families, to be active in civic life. Elizabeth Morrison wasn't just keeping these children alive. She was giving them tools and confidence to build good lives. "That doesn't surprise me," Dr. Emerson replied. "From everything we've learned, Elizabeth understood something that many child welfare professionals wouldn't articulate until the 20th century. Children need more than just food and shelter. They need education, emotional support, a sense of belonging and purpose." She provided all of that, apparently through sheer force of will and competence. Rebecca's research expanded beyond just the immediate story of the Morrison home. She began investigating the broader context of child welfare in 19th century America, discovering that orphanages and children's homes varied wildly in quality and philosophy. Some were harsh, regimented institutions that treated children as problems to be managed. Others, particularly those run by religious organizations, were more caring but often rigidly moralistic and judgmental. A few, like the Morrison home, represented something different, experiments in creating genuine family-like environments where orphan children could heal and grow. What made Elizabeth Morrison's work particularly noteworthy was that she had operated independently, without institutional backing or oversight. She hadn't conformed to any external model or philosophy. She had simply created what she believed children needed, based on her own judgment and values. And remarkably, it had worked. The evidence was overwhelming that the children who passed through the Morrison home had thrived under her care. 6 months into the project, Rebecca received an email that would bring a human dimension to her research in ways she hadn't anticipated. It came from a man named Robert Chin, who identified himself as Sarah Lynn's great-grandson. He had found Rebecca's inquiries through online genealogy forums and wanted to share information about his ancestor. "My family has always known that Sarah came from Virginia, that she had been raised by a white woman who ran some kind of children's home," Robert's email explained. "But we never had details about that part of her life. She rarely talked about her early childhood, and when she did, she focused on happy memories rather than the tragedies that brought her to Virginia. What we do know is that she credited her years in the Morrison home with saving her life and giving her the strength to build a future. If you're researching this history, I'd like to help in any way I can." Rebecca immediately set up a call with Robert, who turned out to be a physician in Sacramento. He was in his mid-40s, articulate and thoughtful, clearly proud of his ancestors' legacy. He explained that Sarah Lynn had lived to be 83, dying in 1955 after a long life devoted to helping Chinese immigrants navigate the complex challenges of American society. She had been a translator, an advocate, and eventually a licensed social worker, one of the first Chinese-American women to achieve professional credentials in that field. "She never forgot where she came from," Robert said. "Both her Chinese heritage and her time in Virginia. She used to tell my grandfather stories about Miss Elizabeth, about the lessons she learned at the Morrison home. She said Elizabeth Morrison taught her that being different wasn't a weakness, that you could honor your own culture while also building bridges to others." That philosophy guided her whole career. Robert had digitized a collection of Sarah's papers, including a lengthy interview she had given to a Chinese-American newspaper in 1948. Rebecca read it with growing amazement. Sarah had been 76 years old when she gave the interview, but her memories of the Morrison home were vivid and detailed. She described arriving there at age 6, traumatized by the loss of her parents and completely disoriented by the dramatic change in her environment. "I spoke no English," Sarah had told the interviewer. "I understood nothing of where I was or what would happen to me. But Miss Elizabeth learned some Chinese words, enough to communicate basic ideas. She made me feel safe even though we could barely speak to each other. And she encouraged the other children to learn from me too. They learned to say simple things in Chinese, and I learned English from them." Miss Elizabeth said that knowing multiple languages made all of us richer, that we should treasure difference rather than fear it. The interview described how Elizabeth had created traditions that honored different cultural backgrounds. When Chinese New Year came around, Elizabeth helped Sarah celebrate it, letting her teach the other children about the holiday and its customs. When Daniel Grant talked about traditions he remembered from the Black community where he was born, Elizabeth listened and incorporated elements into their household celebrations. The Morrison home, according to Sarah's testimony, had been a place where cultural diversity was not just tolerated but actively celebrated, something virtually unheard of in 1880s America. Through Robert Chin, Rebecca was introduced to descendants of 3 other children from the Morrison home. Each family had preserved different fragments of the story, different memories and artifacts that together created a richer picture of what life had been like in Elizabeth Morrison's unconventional household. Collectively, they painted a portrait of a woman who was decades ahead of her time in her understanding of child development, cultural sensitivity, and progressive education. One descendant, Martha Williams, the great-great-granddaughter of Mary Brennan, shared a collection of letters Mary had written to Elizabeth Morrison in the 1890s, after Mary had married and moved to Ohio. The letters were affectionate and grateful, full of references to lessons learned and values instilled during Mary's years at the Morrison home. In one particularly moving letter dated 1897, Mary wrote about becoming a mother herself and realizing how much she had learned from Elizabeth about patience, fairness, and unconditional love. "You taught me that a mother's love isn't limited by blood," Mary had written. "You showed me that family is something you build through daily care and commitment, not something determined by birth. I am a better mother to my own children because of everything you gave me. I hope you know how many lives you've changed, how many of us carry your lessons forward into our own families and communities." These letters revealed something else significant. Elizabeth Morrison had maintained relationships with many of the children after they left her care. She corresponded with them, visited when possible, continued to provide guidance and support as they navigated young adulthood. For many of them, she remained a central figure in their lives long after they had physically left the Morrison home. She had given them not just temporary shelter but lasting connection, a sense of belonging that transcended time and distance. Rebecca began to see her role shifting from pure historical research to something more like restoration and advocacy. These stories deserve to be widely known. Elizabeth Morrison's work represented an important but overlooked chapter in the history of American child welfare, progressive education, and community building. The photograph that had started her investigation was just one artifact in a larger story that needed to be told comprehensively and accessibly. She proposed a multi-format project to the archives director. They would create a detailed academic article for publication in historical journals, ensuring that scholars would have access to the research. But they would also develop a public exhibition, create educational materials for schools, and produce a short documentary film that could reach broader audiences. The director, recognizing the significance and human interest of the story, approved the project and allocated resources for its development. James took the lead on designing the exhibition, working with Rebecca to select photographs, documents, and artifacts that would tell the story effectively. They decided to structure it around the 1882 photograph, using it as an entry point to explore each child's background and subsequent life. The exhibition would trace their journeys from tragedy through recovery to eventual success, showing concretely what Elizabeth Morrison's intervention had made possible. but they also wanted to contextualize the story within broader historical trends. The late 19th century had seen tremendous social upheaval as America urbanized and industrialized. Traditional family structures were stressed by migration, industrial accidents, disease, and poverty. Thousands of children were left without adequate care, and society struggled to develop humane and effective responses. Elizabeth Morrison's work represented one approach, private and independent, grounded in personal compassion and progressive ideals. Dr. Emerson agreed to serve as a historical consultant for the exhibition, helping ensure accuracy and providing broader context. Catherine Grant joined the project to develop materials specifically addressing the experience of Black children in the Morrison home and the significance of interracial care relationships in post-Reconstruction Virginia. Robert Chun contributed resources about Chinese American immigration and the particular challenges faced by Chinese children orphaned in the 19th century. What emerged was a collaborative effort bringing together historians, descendants, archivists, and educators, all working toward a common goal of making this remarkable story accessible and meaningful to contemporary audiences. The project grew beyond what Rebecca had initially envisioned, becoming something that engaged entire communities and sparked conversations about how we care for vulnerable children, how we build inclusive communities, and how individual actions can create lasting positive change. 9 months after Rebecca first examined the Morrison photograph, the exhibition opened at the Mountain State Historical Archive. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Local media covered the story extensively. The exhibition drew visitors from across the region, many of them bringing their own family stories of loss and recovery, of being helped by kind strangers, of finding unexpected communities that changed their lives. Among the visitors were descendants of all 6 children Rebecca had successfully traced. They met each other for the first time at the exhibition opening, these people whose ancestors had grown up together as an improvised family in 1880s Virginia. They exchanged stories and contact information, comparing family traditions and discovering echoes of Elizabeth Morrison's influence across generations and bloodlines. Robert Chun stood before the enlarged 1882 photograph, pointing out his ancestor to his teenage daughter. "That's Sarah," he said, emotion evident in his voice. She was 6 years old there, recently arrived from California, traumatized and alone. And that woman behind her, that's Elizabeth Morrison, who gave her a home and a future. Without Elizabeth, none of us would exist. Our entire family exists because of one woman's courage and compassion. Rebecca watched these interactions with deep satisfaction. This was why historical work mattered. Not just to preserve facts and dates, but to recover stories that could inspire, that could remind people of human capacity for goodness and resilience, that could provide models for how to live with purpose and integrity. The exhibition included a section exploring what had happened to Elizabeth Morrison herself. This had been the hardest part of the research because the records were sparse and contradictory. The Morrison home had operated until 1895, at which point Elizabeth would have been 52 years old. The property had been sold that year, and Elizabeth had disappeared from official records. Rebecca had searched death certificates, cemetery records, asylum registers, and pension applications without finding any definitive trace. The most likely explanation, based on fragmentary evidence, was that Elizabeth had died of cancer in late 1894 or early 1895. A brief mention in a regional newspaper reported the death of Mrs. Morrison, known for charitable work with children, in January 1895, though no details were provided. If this was indeed Elizabeth, she had died quietly, without fanfare or formal recognition, her extraordinary life reduced to a 2-line obituary that didn't even mention the Morrison home by name. But she had left a legacy far more substantial than any newspaper obituary could capture. 8 children who had lived with her in 1882, dozens more who had passed through the Morrison home during its 17 years of operation, all of them carrying forward the lessons she had taught, the values she had modeled, the love she had freely given. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, spreading out across America, many of them never knowing the name Elizabeth Morrison but living lives shaped by her influence nonetheless. The exhibition traveled to 5 venues over the next 18 months, each time drawing substantial audiences and generating meaningful discussion. At the Women's Rights National Historical Park, curators contextualized Elizabeth Morrison's work within the broader history of women's social activism in the 19th century, showing how she represented a generation of women who expanded their roles beyond conventional domesticity to address social problems directly. At the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where the exhibition was shown as part of a series on interracial cooperation during Reconstruction and its aftermath, scholars examined how the Morrison home challenged racial hierarchies and provided a model, however limited, of integrated community building. Catherine Grant presented several talks exploring how Daniel Grant's experience at the Morrison home had influenced his subsequent career as an educator and activist. In San Francisco, where the exhibition was hosted by the Chinese Historical Society of America, Robert Chen and other descendants of Sarah Lin participated in programs exploring the broader context of Chinese immigration, the particular vulnerability of Chinese children in 19th century America, and the significance of Sarah's unlikely journey from California to Virginia and back again. Each venue added new dimensions to the story, connected it to different audiences and concerns, demonstrated the flexibility and continued relevance of historical narratives that are rooted in specific times and places but speak to universal human experiences. Rebecca traveled to several of these exhibition sites, giving talks and participating in panel discussions, continually learning new things about the story she thought she already understood completely. At a symposium in Knoxville, Tennessee, focused on Appalachian history and culture, Rebecca met a social worker named Patricia Daniels who ran a contemporary foster care program in rural Kentucky. Patricia had visited the exhibition and had been struck by parallels between Elizabeth Morrison's approach and current best practices in child welfare. Everything we've learned through decades of research and professional development, Patricia told Rebecca over coffee after a panel discussion, Elizabeth Morrison understood instinctively in the 1880s. The importance of keeping sibling groups together. The need to honor children's cultural backgrounds. The value of providing education and practical skills alongside emotional support. The recognition that children need to feel valued as individuals, not treated as problems or burdens. She was doing trauma-informed care before we had language for it. Patricia invited Rebecca to visit her program and share Elizabeth Morrison's story with her staff and foster families. The visit, which took place on a rainy March afternoon in a community center in eastern Kentucky, was one of the most meaningful experiences of Rebecca's career. She showed the 1882 photograph to a room full of people who dedicated their lives to caring for vulnerable children, and watched as they recognized in Elizabeth Morrison's work a model and an inspiration. She proved it's possible, one foster mother said during the discussion that followed Rebecca's presentation. She proved that you can take children from completely different backgrounds, children who have experienced terrible losses, and create a real family environment where they can heal and thrive. That's what we're trying to do every day. It helps to know that someone succeeded at it over a century ago, that we're part of a long tradition of people who believe every child deserves safety and love. Rebecca left that meeting feeling that the project had achieved something beyond academic contribution or public education. It had provided practical encouragement to people doing difficult and often underappreciated work. Elizabeth Morrison's story, preserved in historical records and crystallized in a single photograph, had reached across time to inspire contemporary caregivers facing similar challenges. The documentary film, completed after 2 years of work, premiered at the Virginia Film Festival to strong reviews. The filmmakers had done beautiful work, combining historical photography with contemporary interviews of descendants, expert commentary from historians and child welfare professionals, and careful recreations of daily life at the Morrison home based on archival evidence. The film made Elizabeth Morrison's story accessible to audiences far beyond those who could visit the physical exhibition. But perhaps the most unexpected and moving outcome of the entire project came 3 years after Rebecca first examined the Morrison photograph. She received a letter, handwritten on good quality stationery, from a woman named Eleanor Morrison Hartwell, who identified herself as Elizabeth Morrison's great-great-niece. "I apologize for not contacting you sooner," the letter began. "I only recently learned about your research when my granddaughter, who is studying history at university, discovered your exhibition online. She told me about the photograph and the story you had uncovered, and I realized with some shock that the Elizabeth Morrison you had researched was the same Elizabeth Morrison whose name appeared in our family records as someone who had caused concern by her unconventional life choices. Eleanor's letter explained that Elizabeth Morrison had come from a prominent Virginia family that had been divided by the Civil War. Elizabeth's decision to serve as a nurse for Union forces had created a permanent rift with her parents and siblings, who were Confederate sympathizers. After the war, the family had essentially disowned her, removing her from family histories and refusing to acknowledge her existence. This explained why Rebecca had found it so difficult to trace Elizabeth's origins and background. But Eleanor, now in her 80s, had always been curious about this mysterious family member whose name appeared occasionally in old papers but about whom no one would speak in detail. The exhibition and documentary had answered questions she had wondered about for decades. More than that, they had revealed that the family member her ancestors had considered an embarrassment had actually accomplished something remarkable. "I am ashamed that my family treated Elizabeth so poorly," Eleanor wrote. "She deserved their support and recognition, not their condemnation. She lived according to her principles even when doing so cost her family relationships and social standing. She devoted her life to helping vulnerable children when she could have lived comfortably doing nothing more than managing a household. She saw need and responded to it, regardless of personal sacrifice. These are qualities to admire and emulate, not to hide away in embarrassment." Eleanor's letter included several items that had been preserved in her family's papers, including 2 photographs of Elizabeth as a young woman before the Civil War changed everything. In these images, Elizabeth looked formal and conventional, dressed in the elaborate fashions of the late 1850s, her expression serious but not yet marked by the hardships she would endure. Rebecca stared at these photographs for a long time, seeing the young woman who would become the determined, capable figure in the 1882 image, imagining the experiences that had transformed her from proper society woman into frontier nurse and independent operator of an orphanage. Eleanor also sent a packet of letters Elizabeth had written to her mother in the early 1860s, letters that had been kept despite the eventual estrangement. These letters, written during Elizabeth's service as a Civil War nurse, revealed her character and values with remarkable clarity. She wrote about the suffering she witnessed, the injustice of war, the courage of ordinary people facing impossible circumstances. She wrote about losing her husband and son, about the grief that threatened to destroy her but that she refused to let define her life. She wrote about her determination to create something positive from terrible loss, to honor the dead by serving the living. "I have seen so much death," Elizabeth had written to her mother in 1864. "I have held the hands of boys barely old enough to shave as they died far from home and family. I have watched mothers lose sons, wives lose husbands, children lose fathers. And I have realized that grief can either destroy us or transform us. I choose transformation. When this war ends, if I survive it, I will dedicate whatever years remain to me to preserving life, to helping those who suffer, to creating something beautiful in a world that has seen too much ugliness. This is how I honor Thomas and baby James, not by withdrawing into private mourning but by living purposefully and helping others do the same." These letters were incorporated into the exhibition materials, providing crucial context for understanding Elizabeth's later choices. They showed her not as some inexplicably altruistic figure but as someone forged by specific experiences, someone who had consciously chosen how to respond to loss and trauma. Her work at the Morrison home wasn't mysterious or sentimental. It was the logical outcome of values developed through hardship and a deliberate decision about how to live meaningfully. Rebecca's final research resulted in a scholarly biography of Elizabeth Morrison, published by a university press and praised for its thorough research and sensitive portrayal of a complex life. The book traced Elizabeth's journey from privileged youth through wartime service to her years operating the Morrison home, examining how she navigated the social, economic, and practical challenges of her chosen work. It contextualized her life within broader historical currents, showing how she was both a product of her time and someone who transcended its limitations. But more than academic success, The project had achieved something that mattered deeply to Rebecca on a personal level. It had recovered a story that deserved to be known, had given voice to people who had been silenced by time and marginalization, had demonstrated that ordinary individuals, through courage and commitment, could create extraordinary positive change. The photograph that had initially puzzled her with its unusual composition had become a window into lives that mattered, that had meaning and significance that echoed forward through generations. 5 years after Rebecca first examined the Morrison photograph, the archive hosted a reunion event for descendants of the children who had lived at the Morrison home. More than 30 people attended, representing 5 of the 8 children visible in the 1882 photograph and several others who had lived there at different times. They ranged in age from teenagers to octogenarians, came from different parts of the country, represented different professions and backgrounds. What united them was a shared connection to Elizabeth Morrison and a recognition that her influence had shaped their families in lasting ways. The event began with Rebecca giving a presentation summarizing everything that had been learned about the Morrison home and Elizabeth's life. Then descendants took turns sharing family stories, traditions, and values that they could trace back to Elizabeth's influence. Many of them had never fully understood where certain family practices had originated, beliefs about education, about treating people fairly regardless of background, about the importance of community service. Now they recognized these as legacies from the Morrison home, teachings that had been passed down even as the source was gradually forgotten. Robert Chin spoke about how his family had always emphasized the importance of serving immigrant communities, of helping newcomers navigate systems and find resources. He had thought this was solely a Chinese cultural value, but now he understood it was also something Sarah Lynn had learned from Elizabeth Morrison, who had helped her navigate a completely foreign culture and had taught her that those who had been helped had a responsibility to help others in turn. Catherine Grant talked about her great-great-grandfather Daniel's commitment to education, his belief that learning was the key to individual and collective advancement. She had known he was a teacher, had understood that education was important in her family. But now she recognized that this emphasis came specifically from his time at the Morrison home, where Elizabeth had made education central to daily life and had convinced children that learning could transform their futures. Martha Williams, whose ancestor Mary Brennan had been one of the children in the 1882 photograph, spoke about her family's tradition of taking in relatives and friends who needed temporary housing, of never turning away someone who genuinely needed help. "I always thought this was just my family being kind," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But now I understand it goes back to Elizabeth Morrison, who never turned away a child in need. My great-great-grandmother learned that from her and passed it down through generations. We've been living Elizabeth's values without even knowing it." The reunion concluded with everyone gathering around the enlarged 1882 photograph, these descendants of the children standing before the image of their ancestors. Rebecca took a photograph of the moment, thinking about how fitting it was. More than 140 years separated the two images, but the connection was tangible and real. Elizabeth Morrison's work had created families, had shaped lives, had sent ripples forward through time that were still visible, still meaningful. Late that evening, after the event had ended and the crowd had dispersed, Rebecca stood alone in the archive's exhibition space, looking at the photograph one more time. She thought about the journey that had begun with a simple observation about an unusual family portrait, a composition that seemed somehow different from typical 19th century images. That difference had been real and significant, pointing toward a story that challenged assumptions about the past and offered lessons for the present. Elizabeth Morrison gazed out from the photograph, surrounded by her 8 children, all of them captured in a moment of calm and connection. Rebecca had spent years learning about these people, recovering their stories, understanding their lives. And in doing so, she had come to admire Elizabeth Morrison more than perhaps any other historical figure she had studied. Elizabeth had lived according to her values even when doing so was difficult and socially costly. She had seen need and responded to it. She had refused to accept conventional limitations on what was possible. She had created something beautiful and lasting in difficult circumstances. "Thank you," Rebecca said softly to the photograph, acknowledging the woman who had lived more than a century earlier but whose influence was still palpable. Thank you for caring enough to build that home, to take in those children, to give them futures. Thank you for showing what's possible when someone truly commits to making the world better. Your story matters. You matter. And I promise that as long as I have anything to do with it, you and your work will be remembered." The photograph offered no response, of course. It remained what it had always been, a frozen moment from 1882, 9 people arranged on a porch in Appalachian, Virginia. But Rebecca felt, perhaps irrationally, that something had shifted, that the act of recovery and testimony had fulfilled an obligation, had completed a circle that had begun when a traveling photographer set up his camera on that long-ago day and captured an image of an unconventional family built by courage and compassion. As she left the archive that night, walking out into the cool Virginia evening, Rebecca felt satisfied in a way that transcended professional accomplishment. She had done work that mattered, had given voice to people who deserved to be heard, had recovered a story that could inspire and instruct. The photograph had revealed its secrets, and those secrets had proven worth the years of effort required to uncover them. Elizabeth Morrison's legacy lived on, not just in the historical record Rebecca had carefully documented, but in the lives of descendants who still carried forward her values, in the contemporary caregivers who drew inspiration from her example, in everyone who learned her story and recognized in it a model for how to live with purpose and integrity. The photograph that had looked harmonious but unusual, that had prompted Rebecca's initial curiosity, had become a portal into a story of resilience, compassion, and the lasting power of one person's determination to make a positive difference in the world.